Okay, thank you, sister. I am really excited to be with you this afternoon and present our fourth in a series on justice. During this series, you've heard from many of my respected colleagues about justice between genders and immigrants and socioeconomic classes. Today, we're going to be exploring racial differences. And I want to start out with a prayer before I get into the remainder of my talk. So let's take a moment, pause, reflect. Good and gracious God, you invite us to be recognized and to reverence your divine image and the likeness in our neighbor. Enable us to see the reality of racism. Open our hearts to those who face hatred, injustice because of their race, their background, their ethnicity. Help us that we might better help them belong. Free us to challenge and uproot racism from our society, our world, and ourselves. For this we pray. Amen. So, we have a very diverse world, and some of these differences are visible. And that's what we are looking at or addressing today. Skin color has been one that has been quite a controversial discrimination topic for some time. We've talked before about gender and socioeconomic, because some of these differences we can't even see differences. They're not apparent to us. But I guess when I was asked earlier this year, to take on this title, I thought, why does Sister want me to address the topic of justice in the racial divide system? And you probably wonder the same thing. What's that old white guy doing up there? I think more than anything, it gave me a chance to reflect and explore. And I took this and thought, if Sister has confidence and faith in me, that I can do a good job. So I'm going to explore the racial divide. All right. The first thing that I thought about when I was exploring the topic was the historical perspective that we see here in the United States. Discrimination belies both our civil and religious traditions. The United States of America rests on constitutional heritage that recognizes equality and dignity and the unalienable rights of all citizens. Further, we are heirs of a religious teaching which proclaims that all men and women, as children of God, are brothers and sisters. Every form of discrimination against individuals and groups, whether they be race, religion, gender, economic status, national or cultural origin, is an injustice. And they need to be addressed, and they will weaken and divide our social fabric and deprive the country of the unique contributions that the many citizens bring to the country. While cognizant of these broader concerns, today, we're going to be looking at how we got to where we are with our situation between white and black. The history of the American Negro is one of strife. It's not that black people have always wanted to be white. In fact, black people want to be black and be recognized as valued citizens and not discriminated against. So we know that blacks, when they were brought over to the colonial times of the United States, they were in the form of a slave. Slavery was predominant, mostly in the South, although it was held within many parts of the colonial part. Eventually, slavery was an institution that became a major bone of contention in the expansion and growth of the United States. The Dred Scott decision ruled that slaves were properties. They were property of their masters, and whether they were in free territory or slave states, they would still be slaves. The ruling upheld slavery, and the issue became more and more contentious As the nation added and expanded westward, over the years there was some concern which states would shift the balance of power as far as the political pro-slavery or anti-slavery or abolitionists. This threatened the Union. And as Abraham Lincoln was campaigning for his presidency, and this actually was during the time of his Senate campaign for the state of Illinois in 1858, he invoked this speech called "A House Divided Against Itself Cannot Stand." Now, this has biblical roots. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 25, Jesus states that, "And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand." Now, that was in response to the Pharisees claiming that he was the prince of devils and he was casting out devils on behalf of the devil. These biblical foundations were also repeated in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said he knew the thoughts of them and said, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. Every city or house divided against itself shall not stand." So there was quite an awareness by Lincoln that this issue, dividing free and slave, was very divisive to the country and could end up tearing it apart. And sure enough, a bitter civil war ensues. The emancipation of the slaves comes at a time when the Civil War is nearing its end. It would be that they would be set free, but that's only the beginning of the problems. As we take a look at our historical perspective, in the post-war era, change was not easy. Reconstruction brought about change. Slaves were no longer property, but were second-class citizens. The 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments, known collectively as the Civil War Amendments, were designed to ensure equality for the recently emancipated slaves. The 13th Amendment said that it banned any servitude except in the case of punishment for a crime. When we look at this, we begin to see, all right, well, legally, there's a change in their status. But throughout the South, Jim Crow laws, as they became known, mark a very different class for the African Americans. Not the same rights as the rest of the citizens. I've got on there on the screen some of these voting restrictions, some of the physical violence that was brought about to intimidate African Americans. All of this was part of what the rest of the country was thinking, well, it's going to take some time for adjustment. But there was an opportunity to test the law, and in 1896, so here we are several decades, 3 decades after the end of the war, Plessy versus Ferguson, a Supreme Court case, was testing the fact. Now, Plessy was 1/8 black. He had a black grandmother, and he tested a Louisiana law that said blacks were not able to ride on the same train cars as whites. He was arrested because if you're 1/8 black, you're black. Now, the Supreme Court, in its establishment on this, said it's all right that we have this segregation as long as it's separate but equal. The separate but equal position is then what becomes the mainstay, the way that this is looked at in the United States. And this is not to say that it was separate but equal. As we begin to see, there was continued to be this discrimination and racism. In fact, it got to the point where the only way to really get away from the intimidation, to keep them from voting, to keep them from holding any political office, meant that, in fact, even economic survival, many African Americans made a mass migration, a migration to cities in the north where there was better paying jobs, social equality. Now, I wouldn't say that it was a perfect union in the north. They still faced a lot of racial discrimination. There were segregated church neighborhoods workplace discrimination, but reforms were coming about as we moved into the 20th century. Some of the changes were educational institutions. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute, a gradual path to equality through some vocational education and economic success. There were a lot of criticisms. There were problems, but as we begin to see racial barriers broken, a lot of crusaders. We see there Jesse Owens in the 1932 Olympics, which were held in Berlin. There was this era of white supremacy in Germany, the host country, and Adolf Hitler. And it's quite a well-noted story, several pictures and books written about this, about Jesse Owens and his performance and winning the gold medal in the Olympic Games in Munich, in Berlin. Part of the problem, I think we still see that Hitler refuses to acknowledge that we've got a race that can compete against the Aryan race. Additionally, in sports, we see in 1948, Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball. At this time, the national pastime had a separate but equal league, the Negro League and Major League Baseball. In 1948, Jackie Robinson was quite the hero, crusader here, as he plays for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he has to put up with quite a little bit of abuse and ill treatment, but prevails, perseveres. And this goes on. We begin to see, I've got Rosa Parks up there as well. Rosa Parks, of course, was refused to give up her seat on the bus in the 1950s. This caused a boycott of the buses in Birmingham. There was the Brown versus Board of Education ruling by the Supreme Court that said we had to desegregate schools. And even though that ruling, there still is problems, as we see the last picture up there I have is of the Little Rock 7. This is a time when the school, Little Rock High School was being integrated, and the National Guard has to be brought out to try to integrate the schools. It isn't even until 1967, when Thurgood Marshall is appointed to the Supreme Court, that the Negro Americans have a say in what is justice. This type of behavior continued to create strife and struggles into the 1960s. I indicated through those decades of the 20th century there was progress, but 50 years ago, even on this, I think it was not this date, but it was maybe it was last week. I think if you see this illustration or this picture up here, the United States was competing in the Olympic Games at Mexico City, and it was October, even though still the summer games, they had them in October of 1968, 50 years ago. And at the time, they give the Black Power the salute. This, I guess it would be equivalent, as you've heard all of the controversy surrounding the taking a knee at the NFL. This causes quite a little bit of squawk back, and they're disciplined by the U.S. Olympic Committee. All along the way, there has been concern and issues here leading up to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act in 1965, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodation. This legislation was bringing about some change, and it was being spearheaded by Dr. Martin Luther King. In 1964, his speech, the March on Washington, where he proclaims his dream, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Keeping that as his foremost thought, this dream that drives he protests in a peaceful manner that we may come to this equality. Well, we see how that ends. 50 years ago, he was assassinated, and problems can persist. Now, we do indicate that we do see progress. African Americans do have more say in the political structure. In fact, here we have a couple of the images that I found in the 60s and 70s, where we see Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for presidency. And that was well before today, where we see this as more commonplace. In 1972, this was the first. And Barbara Jordan, who was quite the influential representative from Texas, serving on the House Judiciary Committee. So political roles and things have been changing. Is the dream alive, though? Well, still we see, in my area, if you are familiar, I teach marketing. Marketing tries to reflect society. In fact, what it would say is, oh, you've got some interesting segments, market segments, as representative of this is different types of people. But I have to say that I'm not sure that these types of brands would be something that would be appropriate. In fact, you can see the Sambo's restaurants, while they were popular in the 70s, are not something that are still around today. It's not that they're insensitive to this. They are actually looking more for, oh, well, I thought this would be something that would honor that particular race. And I'm not sure that that's the right take, even though we look back on it 40 years later. These advertising icons were part of what was changing in society. TV shows, for example, I remember as a child, so I'm going to date myself a little bit here. 50 years ago, the first African American to have their own show. The name of the show was Julia, starred Diane Cannon. She breaks the color barrier and actually plays an African American who has a nursing position, not a maid, not a servant, but is a nurse. This was a revolutionary difference, and it came about only 50 years ago. This was followed with such favorites as Flip Wilson, a very popular comedian, got his own show then after that. Into the 1970s, the Jeffersons, they were moving on up, and the Huxtables by the Cosby Show, all became part of mainstream, changing culture, making it more what we see, all right, that it isn't just an all-white society. Even when I was growing up, I was going to say my literature, my diversity training, looked more at, I saw where just this week they called Black Like Me and the To Kill a Mockingbird were on the America's Read Best Favorite list. In fact, I think To Kill a Mockingbird was said to be the most popular book in that PBS vote that they had the shows through. So our society was becoming more diverse, more progressive, especially since that era where we had legal segregation, discrimination. Yet we need to understand institutionalized racism and ways in which societal actions help perpetuate this. The face of racism looks very different today than it did in the past. Overt racism maybe isn't as easily seen or as roundly condemned. I have to say that even this morning, I saw the flyer about that was distributed on campus about making sure you prepared right for your costume. I think that had a little more to do with Megyn Kelly's decision to talk about, oh, well, maybe you could put on blackface and go out and trick-or-treat or do your Halloween. We need to be more aware of that. I think the result of her show, I mean, her insensitivity and lack of thought there, could be that that's not going to be able to exist much longer. But I thought that was good that we bring that to your attention. Think about this as we begin. So I want to talk or have Rochelle come up and talk with you a little bit about the way that we see racism defined in our culture today. And I think, Rochelle, they're going to come up when you press on the screen. No, they're not.
That's okay. I can talk about them. Good afternoon. Well, it certainly is a pleasure for me to stand up here and to be able to talk to you about racism. Race, prejudice, plus power equals racism. There are 5 types of racism, and quite frankly, I did not realize that there were 5 types of racism. I thought racism was racism. But I'd like to step you through racism. Then I'm going to give you the definitions of the 5 steps, and then I want to talk to you and give you examples of those 5 types of racism. Cultural, embedded in the cultural norms. Active, the KKK, the supremacy, hate groups, terrorist groups. Passive, naivete. Complicit, conscious and willing. Adversive, when in your best interests, effortless. Privilege, benefit even without your participation. Now, cultural means racism can be characterized by the belief that one culture is inherently superior to another. An example of that is African Americans could not be flight attendants until the late 1960s. There were 7 in my class of 67 attendants and only 4 in the previous class. And in my class, I was voted outstanding flight attendant in my class, the first African American to receive that title. Active, KKK, supremacy, hate groups, terrorist groups. Active racism is racism that continues to outwardly display racist ways and ideals such as KKK, the supremacy, hate groups, terrorist groups. The example that I have, a group of white, this is a true situation because it was on the news recently. A group of white college young adults are going around the country to colleges trying to recruit white college students to join their white nationalist hate groups. Passive, naivete. Passive racism is racism we see happening, yet allow it to continue and pretend we don't see it. My nephews in college were talking with some of their white college friends about police brutality, the killing of black unarmed males. Their white friends said to them, if a cop stops you, you need to tell them, I pay your salary. And then show me your badge. Those boys were naive and didn't understand that the consequences for black youth when dealing with police is different from white youth. Complicit, conscious and willing. Complicit racism benefits from an activity that is unlawful and morally wrong. a black woman is standing at the counter to be waited on, and a white woman steps up to the counter and knows that the black person was there first. The sales clerk steps up and immediately starts waiting on the white woman and does not say to the clerk, "She was before me," thus benefiting from the clerk's conscious or unconscious bias. And this has happened to me many times. And the older that I get, now that I'm going towards my 70th birthday, I speak up. I did not in the past. Adversive, when in your best interest, effortless. People who behave in an adversive racial manner may profess open, inclusive, and supportive beliefs in private, but when they are with their white friends, they change their allegiance and deny their support for the minority cause or issue. That behavior can work in reverse. They profess support in public, but speak against minority causes or issues in private. Now I want to talk to you just a little bit about white privilege. We're going to see a clip on it, but I want to introduce you to Peggy Mcintosh. She is the Senior Research Associate for the Wellesley Center for Women and the founder for the National Seed Project for Inclusive Curriculum. Now she says, as a white person, I realized I had not been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had also been taught not to see one of its outcomes, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. She also, if you go online, she has a questionnaire of 40 questions. And in your handout, I list 9 of those questions. And you might want to go and read about the other 40 questions or the other questions that she has. Now, I just want to talk just a little bit about a few things about racism for me. I want to tell you a few different stories so that you get the breadth of what I have experienced as an African American woman. I have mentioned that I was a flight attendant. I was a flight attendant for major airlines in the late 60s. And I got the opportunity to be first stewardess. This was my first time because when you are a flight attendant, you don't get your first flight, you have to earn it. And so I was doing a vacation, someone was on vacation and I was taking that person's place. And I was the first stewardess next to the captain. The first stewardess actually is the person that has control of the cabin and all of the people in the cabin. The co-pilot came out from the area where they fly the plane, the cockpit, and he says to me, the captain does not want you to feed him his dinner. He wants to defer to the third stewardess. And of course, she was white. that cut me to the core, but as a 19-year-old, I didn't know what to do. So I allowed this white woman to take my space. The next issue I want to talk to you about, and this one is very new. This has happened to me recently for over a year and a half. I am the associate that is at Mass for Moen, the nursing home for the Dominican sisters. And I do the Mass, I go to the Mass the first Sunday of every month. And I am the lector. And the priest that I have, that is the celebrant, has been doing this for years, and I came along, and I would get up to read. He would, of course, be behind me. And when I would mispronounce a word, he would shout it out from his seat on the altar. He did this many, many times. And then when I would go back to my seat, he would stare at me until I dropped my head. I endured this for several years. He is no longer there. But I tell you, that kind of racism goes to the core. The other thing I want to share is as I began to prepare for this, and this is a new thing for me to stand up here, I've said that to you, to share my open wounds. But as I prepared for this, and I was saying my morning prayers and my rosary, it was like God came to me and he said to me, Rochelle, I am going to grant you the opportunity to come back into this world again. What I would like to know from you, would you choose to come back as an African American? And I said, my God, of course I will. Now, when I was much younger, I would say, no way. But as I have learned and I have grown, it is just fine because I can weather the storm with the Holy Spirit. Thank you.
So Rochelle mentioned that we were going to talk a little bit about white privilege, and there was quite a little bit that I could find in the research when I was preparing for the speech. The questions that she asked were very interesting. I think she's included some of this on the handout. But I want to share with you a clip that was done recently on the, let's see, get that off of there and go back. This was on the Dr. Phil show. Dr. Phil had an episode that focused on, that focused on this white privilege, and it was so close to...
We had a group of ethnically diverse college students participate in an activity to show ways in which society privileges
All right, there we go. Now I'll be able to see. I think it's a really interesting exercise, and I think you'll get something from this.
to be asking you a series of 35 questions. If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you were able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, take one step forward. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward.
The experience today definitely helped me see the world in a different perspective. I kept stepping forward. And as I was keep going forward, it was like, am I really that privileged? I didn't feel like I deserved to be up there.
If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness, if the primary language spoken in your household growing up was not English, if you have ever tried to change your speech or mannerisms to gain credibility.
I'm from a small town in Connecticut, so I've heard like I live in a bubble. Because I'm white or because I have blonde hair, like, it doesn't mean I should be in front of them.
If you can go anywhere in the country and easily find the kinds of hair products you need that match your skin color, if you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, if you can legally marry the person you love, if you would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs, take one step forward.
I'm already a double minority, being African American, also being a homosexual male. I'm always like expecting myself to be further back.
If you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you have ever been the only person of your race, gender, in a classroom or workplace setting.
It felt like those who were in the front were more comfortable. There was one female behind me. It felt like being a woman possibly come on with an extra challenge.
If you get time off for your religious holidays, during your high school and college years, if you have ever felt like there was not adequate or accurate representation of your racial group, sexual orientation group,
I think one of the biggest things that I have counting against me would be just sexuality. It taught me that there's still a long ways that we as a society need to go.
If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back.
Looking at the people behind you, it just makes you think about why people don't get the opportunities that I do.
There were more than 50 books in your house growing up. If you studied the culture or the history of your ancestors in elementary school, if you were ever offered a job because of your association with a friend or a family member, was ever laid off or unemployed, not by choice, if you were ever uncomfortable about a joke you overheard related to your race, ethnicity, gender, appearance, or sexual orientation, take one step back. Thank you all for participating today.
I'm very aware of my white privilege, but it really showed through when I looked behind me, and most of the people in the very back were people of color.
I was in the back. I'm not ever in the back of anything that I do.
Being in the front made me feel uncomfortable. It's an awkward feeling to like be up there and know that like everyone behind you can look at you, right, but you can't look at them.
I landed in the very back of the crowd. I was a bit surprised. I didn't have very much growing up, but I've always thought that there were other people who had less.
I didn't know I was going to end up in the front. The way I was raised by the border in Mexico, that I would be less privileged, though it's weird to know that I am actually doing good.
I think talking about white privilege in a room full of white people is awkward, but in a room full of different ethnic groups, I think it's necessary.
It's a very sensitive topic. You don't want to offend anyone, but it's true. There are racial and social disparities in America, and these issues need to be talked about.
Okay, I found that really interesting, and I want to talk to a few of the people that were involved in it. Ryan, you wound up very much in the front, correct?
Yes, I did.
When you looked over your shoulder, what was your reaction?
When I turned around and I saw everyone behind me, it was like, whoa, it was it really did prove the point that it does exist.
Did you then or now feel like you've done anything wrong?
It felt like I had done something wrong, even though I couldn't pinpoint, it felt like I shouldn't be here.
Randy, stand up if you will. You were in the back, correct?
Yes.
How'd you feel?
Well, I definitely felt like being in the back, you got to see everyone else, but those in front of us didn't get to see us.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, interesting.
So this idea that one of the first steps that we need is
we got another permit Betty here, everybody.
This now viral video appears to show a woman.
The entire program was taped, so I've got it on there, but I want to talk a little bit. The prescription said that what we needed to do was first be aware. And that's where this demonstration was kind of interesting to when Rochelle and I were looking at the materials. There were a couple other things that I thought, wow, that's kind of eye-opening to be aware of it. And the fact that they had that for college students, I thought, first I thought, well, maybe I try to put it here in our presentation, but I thought it was better on the clip. You could actually see and hear people that were reacting to it. The realization that there is discrimination is the first part. The other part is a conversation. There have been some attempts in the business world that I've talked about in my classes. I think 2 years ago, when there were some issues at Starbucks, they tried to have a program where they wanted to talk about, we're in this all together. It did not go over particularly well. But I did find, now I used to work at Procter & Gamble, and I went to their website for this particular clip, and I wanted to show that their idea is that we needed to start a conversation, and I want you to see this one.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
Listen, it's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you. You hear me?
There are some people who think you don't deserve the same privileges just because of what you look like. It's not fair. It's not.
Remember, you can do anything they can. Difference is you gotta work twice as hard and be twice as smart. Come straight home after practice. You got your ID? Oh, guess I stopped you.
How's your review?
We're good.
You good?
Yeah,
You see?
we're good.
Okay, good. Now, when you get pulled over,
I'm a good driver. Okay?
baby,
Don't worry.
this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
It's not fair. But you keep showing up.
You are not pretty for a black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
So their conversation was to talk about this. The conversation about what constitutes this discrimination, this racism, and trying to understand that other perspective was the point of it. Procter & Gamble has gone on to, because I talk about advertising, their understanding of their customer is one of the hallmarks of their marketing, and I just thought this, particularly the woman that was talking to her daughter about driving, was one of the issues that we've seen so much in the news recently about getting pulled over, more so than white drivers, and that what to do about this. There's a movie that just opened last week. It was out on Friday. My wife and I got a chance to go see the author, Angie Thomas, when she was up at Westerville. The book is called The Hate You Give. The Hate You Give is and they spelled it that way. I thought, she even apologized to anybody that was an English professor because she said it was intentional to do it that way. But the idea was that when you see it, the THUG is the thug. And the thug life was what she was trying to say is thought of for the African American. This rapper that Tupac that was part of what they talk about in this movie showed this this hate you give, and I want to play their clip and encourage you to talk more and understand this.
Little infants.
F's everybody.
Yeah.
All right. So these are all actors from the show. This is the protagonist, star.
You give.
The hate you give. The hate you give. Little infants.
F's everybody.
Yeah.
Mama and Daddy were born in Garden Heights. Mama left the garden when she was a little girl, and she wants us to get out too. Daddy says our life is here, because our people are here.
It's about a young black woman kind of finding her voice.
It's about speaking up, being heard.
It's really about family and community.
Star! What's up?
Star lives in different worlds, her lower-income black community and her white private school.
Garden Heights is one world, Williamson is another. So when I'm here, I'm Star version 2.
She's constantly having to split herself into two parts in order to fit into both worlds.
I have to hide who I am. When I'm at home, I can't be too Williamson. When I'm here, I can't act too Garden Heights.
This is about her awakening. This is about her journey and really realizing I'm gonna be who I want to be.
That's all challenged when this really tragic event happens.
Go back where he told you. Khalil, I'm not playing, go back.
What did you do?
She's the one and only witness.
And now she is faced with the dilemma of, does she speak out?
So when you're ready to talk, you talk.
It's really challenging for Star to think about the level of responsibility that she'll take on in being public.
I need to speak for him. It's about black people, poor people, everybody at the bottom.
No matter who you are, find your purpose. Whatever you're here for, speak up and be heard. You too can get out here and be about change.
Don't ever let nobody make you be quiet.
Everybody who experiences struggle can take that struggle and turn it into something golden.
We live in a complicated world.
No, it doesn't seem that complicated to me.
As a generation, it's time that we stand up and start taking responsibilities for our communities and take them back.
The movie gives a message that's, very real, but also very, very hopeful.
I love being a part of a film that I think is really culturally, politically critical.
We will not stop.
The movie opened up on the 19th, so, but I got an opportunity to see Angie Thomas, the author of The Hate You Give, which she made an appearance in Westerville last month. And in it, it's a fictional story, but the story is about this girl that is in the area that's African American in the city, but goes to an all-white school, almost all-white school. And her dilemma of how to act and what is said when she's back home, what happens when she's in school, kind of is this internal struggle or conflict. And it particularly boils over when at a party, after they've left this party, you saw her in the car, her friend is stopped. And she even tells him, because she was told several times what to do, how to act when the police are there. And he doesn't do it that way. He starts like what Rochelle said, well, what are you stopping me for? And challenging the police. And there's one point where he reaches back in, I think he saw to try to get a hairbrush, and the police thinks he's reaching for a gun, and he's shot and killed. And she really doesn't know how, as a 16-year-old, she doesn't know how to deal with that. And that's really the focus of the movie. And I think it's particularly good to see that from her eyes, from her perspective. Starting the conversation is the critical part, I think, for bridging this gap. And Rochelle's got a little bit more that she wanted to talk about as far as the programs that, let's see, get there we go. I think, Rochelle, I've got it on the next slide. To improve race relations. Here we go. I want you to have your opportunity to talk.
So several years ago, Bishop
Braxton from, I think it's Belleville, Illinois, wrote a paper called The Racial Divide. And I brought a copy for everyone today. And so I was the executive director of Black Catholic Ministries for several years, and our board of directors decided that we wanted to introduce the racial divide to our Catholic churches, to our parishes. And what we did was we hired a consultant to come in and show us how to train us how to be facilitators on the racial divide, to have a conversation about the racial divide and what Bishop Braxton put in his letter. And so we are in the midst of doing these racial divide conversations in parishes. We have been to several parishes. It is also now going to be on a webinar so that conversations can begin on the webinar. In addition to that, I brought you Racism is a Sin. It's another document that was written by Bishop Murray. So we do need to have open dialogue about the racial divide and racism. We owe that to ourselves. We owe that to our communities, to be open and honest about our feelings, what happened when we grew up, and how we can bridge that gap. John and I had that conversation about what happened in his community, and I certainly talked about my community. I think, do you want me to talk about this?
Sure. And you were mentioning a program that you had too.
Oh, right. So the last program that I want to discuss with you is the Bishop Tolton play. Father Augustus Tolton was a priest, and he was located in Chicago. And he was trying to build up his parish and build a church. And he suffered severe racism. The play is coming to ODU. It's going to be held in the Metesic Theater? Okay. And we are hosting the play here, Black Catholic Ministries. It's going to be on November the 9th. There's a matinee, and there is an evening performance for both the 9th and the 10th. And I hope that you will think about coming, that you will think about bringing someone else so that we can begin to have this discussion. We are going to have a couple, a black man and a white woman that are going to discuss the racial divide right after the play. So I invite you all to please consider coming. So
we said